The other day, while doing research for a video, I dug out an old folder with stuff mainly about a Cosmac elf I had. But in the back, I was pleasantly surprised to find some real treasure, a printout of an old BBS session that happened 40 years ago. Seeing CBBS, the granddaddy of all bulletin board systems actually operating, was sort of amazing. Equally amazing was the lack of a requirement for a password. It's hard to believe computerized bulletin boards go all the way back to the 1970s. Equally hard to believe is that it's been 25 years already since they ceased being the dominant form of online communications in favor of the internet. Once upon a time, BBSs were my refuge, a place where I could be myself, hidden behind an anonymous handle, free of the social anxiety that had dogged me since childhood. It didn't matter that I lived in a tiny town with nowhere to go except by car. I could talk to people from all across Ontario or even the world. A lot of good things have come to me via the BBS. Some great games, great conversations, lifetime friends, and even my wife. I'm always astounded whenever I talk to young people who have no concept of what a BBS is, what it meant to share a single computer or phone line with an entire family, even just what a busy signal was. That's one of the side effects of age, I suppose. I first learned of communicating via computer modem as a child in the early 80s. I remember seeing the VIC modem in computer stores. Back then, there was something really cool and weird about being able to communicate with people who weren't right there in front of you. I think that's why I found things like walkie-talkies so interesting. I think I tried to talk my dad into buying a VIC modem, but the 80s were a time of very expensive computer hardware, and lacking a clear and compelling purpose, my dad declined. It would be several years before a close friend brought over his Commodore 64, equipped with the famed VIC modem, to show me what BBSing was actually about. The demonstration was short. He kept having communications problems, and my family kept picking up the phone, which didn't help matters. 3 years later, another close friend showed up with a defective GVC 2400 baud modem like this one. The modem worked, but it just sort of refused to work above 1200 baud. Which was fine. My friend had his very own gray market BBS, and he wanted to show it off and add me as a user. That was how I learned about Telegard, one of the many BBS software packages available, as it was the one that he was running. I was thrilled, although I mostly saw bulletin boards as a means of collecting software, gray market style. My friend effectively gave me that modem, and I became hooked. I branched out onto other boards, wrote messages, exchanged files, and all kinds of stuff eventually like a pro. But soon I realized merely logging into someone else's board wasn't enough. I needed to have my own. Having a BBS was like having your own small country, of which you were the king. Having your own board as a teenager in the early 1990s, however, was not a simple proposition. For one thing, computers were still fiendishly expensive. Most families didn't have a computer at all. After all, it wasn't really a necessity back then. And I certainly wasn't going to be able to afford a $2,000 purchase on my own, not when I was only making $4.50 an hour working a part-time summer job washing dishes. Given that backdrop, our family, like most, only had one computer we all had to share. And given that a BBS needs to be running all the time to be successful, that was never going to work. Another problem was the need for a dedicated phone line. Sure, you could get away with sharing the family's main line, but it was awkward and usually would just end up frustrating everyone, especially your exceptionally social sister. Phone lines were a significant and recurring monthly expense. I probably never would have gotten my own BBS at all, except for a chance discussion with the head of our high school computer lab. My school was a private school, and I was there on a bursary that had effectively hired me as a computer lab assistant. One afternoon, the teacher who ran the lab mentioned that the school was thinking about joining the online world and setting up a bulletin board of its own. Ostensibly, the goal was to use it as a novel way of recruiting students. The teacher wondered if I'd be interested in managing it. They'd provide a computer, a Tandy 1000 TL just like this one, and a phone line, and the rest would be up to me. Well, let me think about that now. Of course I said yes, and in 1991 the Hilltop BBS, named after our school's nickname, was born. At least, I think it was 1991. The thing is, after nearly 30 years of not really thinking about it, my memory of my BBS has mostly disappeared, sadly. I can kind of put a rough fix on its lifespan, though. Remember that video I did on the C64 Link cartridge? Well, among the diary entries I had from 1992 that I was going through in that video, I found some mentions of a girl I was talking to who was a user on my board. Those posts were from 1992, so I know it must have been running at least a while before then. On the other hand, I know I moved out in 1998, and the board definitely would have been down before that. In doing a bit of digging online, I was amazed to discover an archive of FidoNet messages from 1996, and there I am talking about another expensive hobby of mine, boating. Yeah, I don't care how expensive you think vintage computing is right now, nothing rivals the sinkhole potential of boat ownership. Anyway, we can see from the message footer that I was probably running Telegard 3.01, which I sort of vaguely remember upgrading late in the BBS's life. The date is November 1996, so this is likely close to the end, given how the internet was taking over by then. Anyway, yeah, for our quote-unquote school bulletin board software, I chose Telegard. I liked Telegard's features and easy configurability, as well as its familiarity. But one crucial aspect was cost. It was free. At least, I think it was. I don't remember ever paying for it. Telegard was rumored to be a derivative of World War IV, or WWIV BBS. Introduced in 1984 by Wayne Bell of Los Angeles, World War IV quickly became a popular choice of BBS sysops, mainly because Bell provided the source code to those sysops, which allowed a high degree of customization. Bell also introduced World War IV Net, a network that allowed World War IV boards to exchange messages amongst each other across regions and even across country. It's quite possible Telegard did in fact borrow code from World War IV. In fact, Telegard's own source was heavily borrowed to create another BBS software called Renegade, and borrowing code was pretty common back then. But a lot of this stuff is kind of hard to pin down. Anyway, with respect to the Hilltop BBS, the original plan was to keep the BBS computer in our school computer lab. I had access to the lab and could easily log into Telegard remotely to admin the BBS. Unfortunately, we soon found it impossible to keep the BBS actually operating for any length of time. Somehow the computer kept getting shut down or used for other purposes. Eventually, I suggested we move it someplace less accessible. Our computer teacher agreed, and that's when he surprised me. He suggested that perhaps I could take it home. The school could have the phone line moved to my house, and I could run the board from there. I was stunned, and quite frankly, I thought I was dreaming. But of course, I took him up on the offer. Within a week, I had my very own BBS in my very own bedroom. The Tandy 1000 TL didn't come with the deal though. It was still relatively new and the school needed it for other things. But they did supply a Tandy 1000 SX, and we were off and running. Setting up a BBS, if you were into computers and stuff, was amazing. The only modern equivalent I can think of to that experience is possibly setting up a YouTube channel. There's just so much anticipation, the excitement of sort of being your own boss, and knowing that strangers were going to come and hang out in this little digital world you created. Anyway, let's take a look at what went into setting up a BBS back in the day. I'll also set up a fake user to fake a login, and we can see what my fake BBS would look like from the eyes of a fake first user. I regret I can't really show it exactly the way an end user would have seen it. This is 2021 after all. And while I still do have a landline, it was converted to fiber optic recently and doesn't really get along well with old modems. So we'll have to just settle for doing that local login I was talking about. Okay, so first things first, we need a computer. I kind of agonized about what to use here. I have a number of vintage PCs, any one of which would be just fine for running a BBS. Initially I thought about using my IBM PS2 Model 30. That was one of our first family computers, and although it never ran my BBS, it was the same model of computer my friend hooked up a modem to and the very first computer I ever BBS'd from. Unfortunately, my Model 30 has some PS2 shoes. It's suffering from the usual hard drive and floppy drive and leaky caps problems, and that's too bad. I also have a Model 70, which, while it has some PS2 shoes of its own, does at least feature a working hard drive. However, one of the programs I want to install here requires a math coprocessor, and of course this machine doesn't have a coprocessor, and the one that I have doesn't fit this type of socket. I could go with this Shoebox 286 PC by SIG. It definitely has some visual impact, but a compact machine like this probably wouldn't have survived while doing 24/7 service, so it's not really authentic in my opinion, so that's out. Now, I could use a Tandy 1000 SX just as I did for a short while when my BBS began, but unfortunately it doesn't have a hard drive like the one from my school did, so it's kind of useless. I also have to rule out my Computerland business computer systems. One does have a hard drive, but sadly it's defunct. The other doesn't have a hard drive at all. Now, I do have this lovely, completely generic 386. This machine was actually produced by Intel. I think, going by the labels and such, it may have been a prototype or reference design intended to give developers a sense of what was possible with the upcoming 386 SX CPU. The only issue with this one is that its BIOS battery is deader than King Tut. I don't have a replacement, but this machine does have a coprocessor and it does have a working hard drive, and I can use a generic floppy drive to get stuff loaded into it, so we gotta do what we gotta do. It's got a roomy 80 meg hard drive, and that's more than enough for what we'll be doing here. Plus, being 16 megahertz, it's sort of in the middle between what I started my BBS on and what I ultimately finished up with. Now, for visuals, you can bet I'm using that IBM 8513 I just got. It ain't legit BBSing if it's not on an eye strain-inducing CRT. Now, obviously a BBS needs a modem, or at least it does if it were actually going to receive callers. But since that's impossible in our case, I'll just settle for having a modem present as eye candy. And really, what could be better eye candy than this tiny cube laser by Telebit? These things were renowned for their speed and tiny size. It's a portable modem that can be run on a 9-volt battery and was capable of an impressive 14.4 kilobaud. But I can go one even better. How about a prototype of the cube laser? Yep, this is a clear case prototype cube laser showing all the guts crammed inside. Yeah, look at how all that stuff is packed in there. This will look great next to this generic 386. Yeah, I know it won't actually be doing anything, but... So, what BBS software are we going to use? Well, originally for this video, I actually wanted to set up CBBS, which is what was featured in my earlier video. Unfortunately, CBBS is from a very different generation of computing. It doesn't come pre-compiled, it's not very easy to install, and basically it comes just as assembly source code that you have to compile all by your darn self. And to be honest, that's a little bit over my head, and that's before we get into the hardware. While I do have some CPM-capable systems, none of them has a hard drive, and from what I've read, most CBBS systems relied on hard drives for obvious reasons. Finding a working hard drive for a CPM or S100 based system today, not easy. Well, why not go with the familiar here? I'd love to see Telegard again. After all, it's been 25 years since I shuttered my board. I do have a backup of my board somewhere, but I still can't find it. So for now, we'll go with a fresh install. Here it is, Telegard 2.7, all zipped up and copied to our C Telegard directory. I have my own board in a folder called Telegard, so this is already getting the nostalgic juices flowing. Boy, it's been a long time since I've used the DOS PK unzip program for anything. Honestly, I'm not sure if I'm doing this right, but here we go. Nice, nothing catastrophic there. Okay, so now we've got a mess of Telegard files, and we've got an installer. The actual install of a Telegard BBS is pretty darn easy, which again is one of the reasons why I favored it. There's just a few menu options here, and it's mostly to do with changing some of the install paths and stuff like that, and also repairing the status.dat file, which could sometimes become corrupt if somebody didn't hang up properly or some other thing afflicted your board. I don't really see any need to change the install paths, and my nobody's ever going to call BBS hasn't had any activity yet, so there's no reason to rebuild the status.dat file. The A files directory here is particularly important though. It contains the customizable ANSI messages that can be used to provide a warm welcome and goodbye to your users. ANSI, if you didn't know, technically stands for the American National Standards Institute. They've been around for a long time, and they've created standards for all kinds of things: products, services, systems, you name it. However, for us PC-based BBS users, ANSI became shorthand for what is otherwise known as IBM Code Page 437, an extended set of 128 characters that provided a precious smattering of graphics characters. Because modem speeds were so slow, sending bitmap graphics wasn't practical for online services like BBS's. The use of so-called ANSI graphics meant that you could provide a little bit of an artistic flair for your board. And you know what? Plenty of people knew how to make some pretty darn good lemonade from those lemons. They were even able to animate them. Anyway, we've got the required ANSI driver loaded on our PC here, so we'll be able to see and even create some ANSI graphics for our Telegard board. Okay, everything is ready to go here. Let's fire up Telegard and say hello to an old friend for the first time in 25 years. Yes, this definitely looks familiar. As a BBS sysop, this control panel was your castle. You were the lord of the realm, and you could dispense rewards and rough justice with just a few key presses. Let's take a tour, shall we? First, we should probably do some general configuration. We don't need to worry about modem configuration, obviously, but file paths and BBS configuration is a good jumping off point. This section lets us officially name our board along with its phone number. I think I'll name it what I named it originally, the Hilltop. I'll also put its original phone number in, but yeah, don't dial it, okay? Sysop alias. You know, honestly, I can't remember what I used. It's been 30 plus years, and yeah, I haven't thought about it in a long time. I think I initially used one of my high school nicknames, Schmeds. Yeah, don't ask. Anyway, yeah, we'll lock that in there, and now that I've done that, I think I actually do remember my original sysop handle. I think it was the Prez, as in president. Oh well, I'll just leave it like it is. Also, let's not repeat the mistake I made as an overeager sysop. There. That'll keep people from pestering me at 3 o'clock in the morning when Trade Wars falls up. And yeah, it's 2021, I should change the sysop password, although absolutely no one is ever getting anywhere near this computer. Next, we'll take a quick boo at the access control settings. Telegard uses a system of numbers from 0 to 255 that define how much power or capability a user has. 255 is the max, that's sysop level. A few points below that is officially co-sysop at 250. I don't remember exactly what a co-sysop couldn't do, but they did have most sysop powers. The rest of these just set down basics like who can send a private or public message, who is exempt from certain restrictions on downloads, and it also allows you to establish sort of quasi-co-sysops who can control specific areas of your board, like file section or message boards. Another feature we can check out here is the file system itself. File sharing was the lifeblood of many boards, particularly gray market boards, aka Wares boards. Being basically owned by my school, Hilltop BBS was obviously required to be a shareware board, if anything at all, and file swapping was generally pretty light. Now, my friend's pirate board, on the other hand, provisions like how many kilobytes you got download credit for and such were necessary to stop people from committing that most cardinal of BBS sins, leeching. Leeches were detested by BBS sysops, especially Wares board sysops, because they didn't really contribute anything, and the long periods of time they spent downloading, especially on a single line board, meant that the board was inaccessible to others for long periods of time. Since people often gamed these upload-download ratios and often uploaded junk that nobody wanted, many BBSs enacted validation procedures, which meant the sysop actually had to verify what you uploaded was good before you got your download credits. Let's see what else there is here. Oh yeah, we can also set what archiving options the board uses. My memory is a little bit dim here, but I think you could set Telegard to basically repack everything into a new archive and attach a custom comment or message to it so that those who saw it later could know where it came from. The most popular archiving formats, I think, were PKZip, maybe LZH and LHA, and then later RAR. The preference depended on what you wanted in terms of compression and how easy it was to split a large file into many smaller ones. As a former BBS user, I definitely remember it being a little bit frustrating sometimes with some of the larger files because they'd often be split into 15 or 20 different archive files, and the boards weren't always reliable about keeping them all online at once. We also have some system variables here that can define limits on how many posts a person can do per call, things like chat text colors, how long sysop logs went back, and so on. Next, we can configure our new user settings, which define how much access a person has when they first log on, and how much they have after you validate them. It was pretty common practice with most boards not to give new users normal user access right away, just to make sure you didn't have trolls posting spammy or offensive messages, or just generally doing bad things. There were also some random options like what menu to start the user at and so on, but we'll leave those at default. Here's an exciting bit, network configuration. Now, this isn't quite what we normally think of when we think of networks today, but in the pre-internet era, message networks like FidoNet were amazing. These were forums that basically reached all over North America and the world. One of the most exciting things when I had my board was joining FidoNet. There was just something amazing about having these messages from people far, far away magically appearing on your board every day. Of course, it wasn't really magic. Basically, boards would be dialing each other and exchanging messages in batches, usually at night. I think my board used to dial a hub of sorts, and then sometimes that hub would call us. The technical minutiae I'm not really sure about, but in a time when a long-distance call just to the city adjacent to you could cost 25 cents a minute, talking to someone in another country seemed pretty amazing. Telegard also allowed you to change certain user prompts as you wished. For example, my Wares BBS friend's sysop handle was the hippie, and his sysop engaged chat message was, "The hippie has a bone to pick with you." And let's just say he had lots of bones to pick with me because I was an annoying newbie who constantly pestered him to talk. We can also mess around with some of Telegard's default colors. Pretty much everyone did that. Everyone wanted their board to be their own. And I should mention one of the banes of a BBS user's existence, the post-call ratio. BBSs were like small communities, and nobody wanted to have a community that looked completely dead. So many boards, including for a time mine, had a requirement that you post something to the message boards in order to be able to maintain access. The idea here was to keep things on your board lively and to keep people from simply tying up your board for hours playing games and downloading and not really interacting with anyone. I'm not sure post-call ratios are really effective though. I find the quality of someone's work is often inversely proportional to the amount of arm twisting you have to use to get them to do it. I think I eventually abandoned this feature after much protest from my users. Okay, so with general variables out of the way, we can start to breathe some life into our board here by configuring some message bases. Message bases were the equivalent of the categories you often find in forums. A typical board would have a general message section, as we have here, and then usually there'd be some specific topics like buy and sell, jokes, and even some inappropriate stuff. And of course, you could segregate access to certain forums by requiring certain access levels to see them. Now, I'll be honest, I have no memory of what these T files are. The menu editor is handy too. You can change or add or remove functions, or change the keys to an active function in here. Again, it's been 25 years, and that's really sucked away most of my memory on how to do this sort of thing. I do remember editing menus from time to time to try and make them more uniform across the board, or to add links to things. But yeah, we're just going to leave those alone here. Event Editor is sort of like Windows Task Scheduler. This is where you'd have Telegard run certain functions like packing message bases or sending off network messages to nodes. You could also run DOS scripts to do system functions like restart programs, clean up log files, run backups, and so on. A fun little diversion was Telegard's voting system. Just as you can on Facebook, you could poll your users on any number of questions. I remember asking my users stuff like, should we change the BBS name, and also how many people would be more interested in attending one of our infamous BBS user get-togethers. Oh god, those could be fun. Often they were just silly joke questions, though, meant to keep people laughing and engaged. Conferences? Yeah, I have no idea what those do. I think the conferences may have been where people could actually chat back in the day, if you had the board running in a multi-user environment. I only had that very briefly near the end when I configured one of my voice lines to be a secondary line for my BBS. I don't think Telegard's multi-line features worked very well from what I recall, so yeah, I don't remember. But we won't use that anyway because I'd only be talking to myself. The file-based editor worked pretty much like the message-based system, only for files. A well-organized BBS was definitely a plus, so it was common to group files into different categories like games, utilities, and so on, assigning different file folders for each. I recall when I upgraded my board with a CD-ROM drive, I inserted a disk full of shareware and had to spend a good while configuring file system categories for the different categories of software on the disk. Just like the message bases, you can lay down the requirements for user access. You can also control the archive system used for files and so on. We have a text editor here too. I'm not really sure I ever used that feature, but as some parts of the BBS were plain text files, I guess it could come in handy. Finally, there's the protocols. Downloading back in BBS days wasn't quite as point and click as it is today. When you downloaded or uploaded something, you had to pick a protocol to use to do it. Xmodem was an early file transfer protocol. Ward Christensen, one of the co-inventors of CBBS, had developed a terminal program called Modem just prior to CBBS. Xmodem was originally devised as a hack to allow files to be transferred between two users running the modem terminal. Xmodem essentially broke files up into 128-byte data packets, which is the basic block size used on CP/M floppy disks. The packets had a single byte checksum attached that allowed the computer at the other end to calculate whether the packet received contained good data. Xmodem suffered a little from being slow and an occasional tendency to corrupt the file being sent. Newer protocols such as Y and Z modem improved on those fronts. For BBS users, it was not uncommon for downloads to fail, necessitating starting over again. Sometimes you had to try different protocols to find one that worked reliably. Now, one area I've left out here is the user editor. Obviously, this is one of the most important functions a sysop had at their fingertips. It let you see who exactly was phoning your board and also keep tabs on what they were doing, how often they were calling or not, as well as birthdays and fun stuff like that. You also had control over access levels, which enabled you to dish out rewards or dole out punishments as required. In addition to the access levels, though, Telegard also had a system of alphabetic flags that allowed you to differentiate what two users with the same overall access level could get into. If a user had an A flag, they might be able to get into certain message bases or file systems that the other user with the same access level otherwise could not. You'll note there's no option to create a new user here. That was done by the user by themselves at logon. Now, one last task before we fire things up. I think some customization is in order. Nothing says I'm lazy like leaving all the default Telegard ANSI welcome messages and stuff around. I'm going to change that right now. In the early 90s, one of the most popular utilities for drawing ANSI pictures was the appropriately named The Draw. I won't get into the minutiae of how The Draw works. Suffice it to say, it's nowhere near as friendly as a modern paint program. I really struggled to get just a basic welcome screen and main menu screen out of it. So many keys to remember. I also kind of buggered up saving my welcome screen. I forgot ANSI files kind of follow your cursor around. So having my cursor up in the stars there meant that's where my BBS login prompt would end up. I had to bring my cursor down to the bottom right of the screen and spacebar it a couple times, and then resave to get things in the right place. Now, I could edit some of the other files here, but obviously as no one is ever going to call this thing, that's probably pointless. My goal here is just to give you a little bit of the flavor of setting up a board. Of course, for people for whom ANSI wasn't available, you did have to do up some non-ANSI substitute messages so they could see what was going on. I did always kind of hate having to do doubles of everything though. Okay, now that we have the rudiments in place, why don't we spice things up a little bit with a staple of nearly every BBS that ever was, door games. These were online games that your users could play solo or against each other in sort of a turn-based arrangement. Some games could do live multiplayer if your board was set up for more than one line. But usually it was just log in, play your turns, log out, and then wait for someone else to play theirs. Door games were kind of a double-edged sword sometimes. They could create considerable loyalty to your BBS if a really good game got going between users. But they could also tie up your BBS for hours, preventing access by others. One of the most popular door games ever was Trade Wars 2002. Trade Wars was first written in 1974 by Chris Sherrick. Sherrick's freely licensed code allowed many other programmers to develop their own derivatives over the years. In 1986, Gary Martin and John Pritchett developed a version that ran as a World War IV chain, aka a door. Turbo Pascal, the language World War IV had been programmed in, allowed these external programs to be called and used. Trade Wars would be developed in several different ways. The version I think I had was called Trade Wars 2002 version 2. It was a pretty impressive piece of software considering it was mostly text-based. One could lose entire days exploring its randomly generated universe. Anyway, we'll get it set up here. The local setup process is pretty simple. It's mostly just extracting files to the directory you want to install it in, and then running the installer. I'll have to go with the defaults here, including leaving it unregistered. 30 years later, I have no idea where my Trade Wars registration key is. Ah yes, and then we get Big Bang. Man, this is striking a nostalgia chord. It's so weird watching this again 30 years after I first set it up. Yeah, this program was a key feature of this variant of Trade Wars, its ability to create an entire universe full of trading posts, planets, and even patrolling Federation police. I love all the nebulae names, although, it looks like this one here's got the same name spelled differently. Mistake? Man, it's a pity no one will ever play this. A good Trade Wars game, when it got going, was highly engaging. I never really played it myself. I didn't want to tie up my own board. I preferred to keep it available for others. But I did occasionally watch the goings-on. For some of my users, this was their secret life, and it was really fun just seeing what they did with it. Now, having installed the door game itself, I need to add an option for it in the online programs menu. And this is where 30 years of time passage definitely leaves me a bit lost. I remember there was something called a fossil driver involved. Basically, this was what enabled ongoing communication between the local computer and the remote user. Typically, Telegard would drop a file like door.sys, and this would enable the player to jump out of the BBS and into their game. I remember having some difficulty getting this to work back in the day. I really don't know how I figured it out without Google. Even now, I'm not 100% sure. Since we can't really test this via modem, we'll just have to pretend it works. Alright, we're ready to rock here. Let's fire up Telegard again, and since we can't do a dial-up login, I'll just use the local login. Nice, here we go. Does your terminal support ANSI? Of course it does. What kind of Neanderthal do you think I am? Alright, enter new if you want to set up a user account. 90s BBSs. So trusting. And here's the obligatory new user message. Yep, we gotta fill in some details. Interesting, it doesn't allow lowercase for your handle or username. It's all uppercase. I don't remember that. Okay, well let's just follow through here. At least it allows lowercase here. And it also has auto capitalization, so that's nice. And of course we're calling from Canada. In 5 years of running a BBS, I don't think I ever had an international caller. I doubt anyone would have been willing to pay the long distance charges just for the privilege of connecting to some podunk board in Ontario, Canada. And we'll fake an address, and a fake phone number. Yeah, actually this part's pretty authentic. Birthday. Well, this being the early 90s, yeah, most people I recall would have had birthdays in the 1970s. Sheesh. Most of them would be at or nearing their 50s now. I'm not sure if this next question affected Telegard's behavior or was purely an informational thing. I think the latter. PC Junior. Good lord. Occupation. I doubt most people being young like me even had one. This question always invited snark. Yep, we're blinking. I feel sorry for the non-blinking guys. They were definitely missing out. And here's some general questions about my screen setup. If I want screen pausing, yeah, that's kind of handy. There is a way to pause the screen in Telegard. I think you hit the P key, but yeah, the faster your modem is, the harder it is to stop it when you need to. Ah yes, the password. Let's go for something ultra secure. Thank God for no strong password requirements. And there it all is, my fake user conjured out of the recesses of my brain and into digital life. Kind of exciting. I don't get a lot of 15-year-old day traders around here. Now, a note about what you're seeing here. All this stuff up top with the username access levels and stuff, the user doesn't actually see that. That's for your sysop eyes only. It's just so that if you turn on your screen, you can see who's messing about in your board. Alright, and here we have the new user sysop suck-up letter. Kind of a passive-aggressive thing, or maybe it's aggressive-passive. You must send in the letter explaining why you want access, but don't worry, no matter what you put in the message, we'll let you in anyway. So yeah, let's test that theory. Ooh, the Telegard message editor. Man, I haven't seen this in so long. Yeah, this is absolutely primitive. Commands are accessed by hitting the slash key, I think. Yeah, we can't really do much here as this is just a sysop suck-up message, but I'll show you a few other options once we're done here. There, that'll get me in good with management. And we'll save it there. And we're logging in. This account will be limited until I auto-validate it, but we can see a few things that were staples of the login experience right off the bat. The last few callers list was particularly important if you had certain friends you conversed with. I remember fighting my way through hours of busy signals hoping to catch up with someone, only to see they hadn't logged in yet. Or I might be excited to see they had logged in, and there might be a message waiting for me. System announcements were obviously important, especially if you had things like planned maintenance or wanted to just take the board offline so you could use your own darned computer for something else. Or just to let people know if they were doing something to annoy you. And of course, we get presented with bulletins, which kind of are the reason for BBSs having the name they do. Horst Mann's 313 area BBS list is a time capsule. Look at all the creative names used here. Yeah, a lot of people got into this hobby. The bigger the area, the more there were. Next we have BBS Ethics, written by a guy named Steve many moons ago, laying out the do's and don'ts of operating in an online world. There's over 14 points delivered with just a light salting of snark, but there is some truth contained therein. I don't think I removed this or anything on my own board. After all, nobody read these anyway, and if someone did and didn't like the snark, yeah, I could just blame Steve. For example, one thing BBS sysops really hated was when people didn't use the proper log-off process and just simply disconnected, just like that. This might seem trivial, but it was a real problem because sometimes it could hang the board, which if you were a single-line board meant that other users couldn't call it until you reset. Other suggestions, don't do the whole testing 1, 2, 3 thing, not necessary. Don't chat up the sysop if you have nothing interesting to say. Don't be a troll. And what's this? Most boards don't like handles or usernames? That's news to me. Also, don't assume people know your local jargon. Definitely don't be a troll. Don't be a hog. Don't call a BBS just to find other BBSs. Actually read stuff once in a while. Yes, there are stupid questions. Let the sysop know if the board goes rogue. Oh, and once again, don't be a troll. Especially not to the sysop. Remember, you're a guest here. Your First Amendment rights stop right at my COM port, so don't think I can't upgrade or shut you down if you say stuff I don't like. Alright, here's our new user access menu. This is a crippled version of what the user usually sees. I think what I'll do here is go back and auto-validate our user so we can interact properly. There we go. And we'll sign in again. Okay, moving along to the main menu. Perfect. Now our user can see the whole menu and we've got our Hilltop logo right up top there. Okay, so what have we got here? BBS lists. BBS lists are an important one if you're a sysop. Since we didn't have things like Facebook posts to alert us to stuff we didn't know about, the only way to advertise and get people to call your board was to add it to another board's BBS list. That, or slightly add stuff about your board to your signature. You can see a few examples here, and yeah, if this was some other guy's board, I could just add my own like this, and so there we are. Yeah, these are pretty important. I believe there were also lists that circulated around as text files that were used as sort of a phone book. The auto message is sort of the system announcement. You could read and reply to it, but I think only sysops could create it. So here's the file section, and I put up a few fake files to demonstrate. Obviously, we can't download or upload anything, but yeah, for so-called public domain boards like mine, there really wasn't a lot of great stuff going on here. Now, on a Wares board, however, this section was like being let loose in a giant toy store. If I were inclined to upload something, obviously I could do that here. It's not quite the same thing as uploading to a modern website. You can't just drag and drop whatever you're sending there. You actually had to give it a file name and then go through the protocol selection and use your terminal program to send it up. I can't demonstrate all that here right now, but you can sort of see what it would look like if I were to just do an offline file. Yeah, that's another thing. Because we had such small hard drive capacities, we often couldn't keep all of our files online, so we would often have to take some off to a backup medium and then mark them as offline. Users could request whatever offline file they were looking for to be put up. In fact, I think that's actually the reason I ended up having a tape backup that I could back my BBS up with in the first place. Tape provided a really cheap way to store lots of files. Alright, and here are the message bases. And as I said, it's pretty important to have these going if you want your BBS community to thrive. It's a very basic interface, but you can change bases, or in our parlance, forums, send new messages, reply to old ones, and so on. And of course, when replying to someone, you had access to quoting options, which in my opinion actually worked better in some ways than they do on today's forums. Personally, as a sysop, I very much enjoyed all the love notes I got. It made me feel really special. While I'm here, I might as well exercise my privilege and vote on whatever silliness the sysop is allowed out there. Some of these menus aren't working. I suspect that's because this isn't a real login session, so a lot of the real system info they draw from doesn't exist yet, or it's just not shown. Anyway, that's the gist of it. And I gotta tell you, it's a weird feeling seeing stuff like this after so long. I honestly had zero recollection of a lot of it. It's almost hard to believe I was neck deep in this stuff every day all those years ago. It almost feels like there was another person doing that stuff. BBSs were really something special. Some might argue that BBSing was just a lower tech version of what we have now with the internet, but it really wasn't. Today, everyone and their brother is on the internet, but back in BBS days, only the tiniest sliver of humanity even knew about these things. It was a community of diverse, truly unique people that society often raised an eyebrow to. We exchanged messages, we played games, and we even met up now and again in real life. We had our own way of speaking. Those acronyms you use today, that was all pioneered in our now lost world. We did have a little bit of that online edge, but not anything quite as nasty and vindictive as a Twitter mob. It's so hard to believe something that was so cutting edge is now 3 decades in the past. Doing this video has made me realize just how much I miss it. I had thought of setting up a BBS as an adjunct to my channel, but really I don't think there's a ton of appeal out there beyond a quick hit of nostalgia. The modern internet is so much more user-friendly and powerful. I really hope I can find my backup tape one day though. It would be amazing to see what we were talking about decades ago. It gave me quite the thrill to see stuff I'd written on FidoNet back in 1996. Anyway, that's kind of it for this one. Next though, I'd like to show you the only other piece of BBS software I considered running. And this software put all those ANSI and text BBSs in the shade. Anyways, thanks so much for watching, and stay tuned for our next episode.